Welcome to Almost Cooperstown.
I'm Mark.
And this is Gordon, and we love talking about baseball.
Welcome, everybody. We are here on the final episode of Season 2 of Almost Cooperstown. We're very lucky to have gotten this far. It's been a really great experience for us, and we're even more lucky today to have Adam Korengold here with us, who worked on one of the most interesting pieces of sort of baseball history that I've seen recently. There was a book put out, edited by Sean Foreman and a few others, that was going over sort of the history of the Negro Leagues and what had gone on during that time. It was a series of essays. And Adam, you went through that and pulled out just some absolutely fascinating data.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be with you here today.
I would love first just to tell us a little bit about yourself, just, sort of what you do, who you are, and then just sort of, how you ended up kind of falling into this really interesting, statistical look at historical baseball.
Sure. So I've been a baseball fan as I could imagine both of you have been for most of my life. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. So for the first 33 or 34 years of my life, I kind of borrowed the Baltimore Orioles from my fandom. And then when I went to graduate school in New York, I kind of borrowed the Yankees. This was when they were winning a bunch of pennants in the late 90s. And professionally, I've been in kind of business research, benchmarking, increasingly quantitative stuff for about 20 years now. When I started in this kind of work, I worked for a company called CEB, which did a lot of business reporting. I worked for a guy who was an architect before he went and got his MBA and started working for CEB. He was a devotee of someone named Edward Tufte, who's kind of the guru of what they now call data visualization, but which 20 years ago was just called, well, the charts and graphs that you put into the report. So I've been doing this for a long time. During the pandemic, of course, we were all kind of sitting at home and figuring out, well, what do I do with all this spare time when I'm not commuting, I'm not seeing friends and family, not doing a whole lot. So I ended up joining SABR, the Society for American Baseball Research. And one of the things that I started getting into increasingly also was visualizing the data of stuff that was just interesting, because this is still something that I do in my work. I run an analytics and data visualization group in my day job, which is at the National Library of Medicine. That's part of the National Institutes of Health. And I started getting really interested in, well, how can we visualize baseball data? Because especially when you look at books like the one that you just cited and a lot of the research that comes out of SABR, it's really heavily quantitative. It's got a lot of mathematical equations in it, but it doesn't visualize the data quite as well. So what I started getting really interested in was, how can we take the data that we see on the back of a baseball card, or maybe even on a larger scope, and visualize that to really make it resonate. We're a very visual society right now. We don't like looking at spreadsheets, I think, as much as we used to. We have a very low attention span. So if you want to say something and really make an impression in a very short amount of time, it really, really helps if it's visual. So when Negro Leagues, our major leagues, came out earlier this year, there were a couple short articles in it that gave some top line data about the Negro Leagues. And just as a backstory to this, the golden age of the Negro Leagues was roughly between 1920 and 1948. The whole reason why we had the Negro Leagues was basically the systemic racism that's always been here, where for the first 50 years of the 20th century, Major League Baseball excluded Black players from, frankly, all levels of professional baseball, not just the majors, but also the minors. So the Negro Leagues, as they were called back then, were created as a place for Black players to play and Black fans to see Black players play, because otherwise they were excluded from the white major leagues and the white major league stadiums. Something that we've heard a lot over the years is, well, Negro League statistics weren't quite as good, or we don't know what the quality of Negro League play was because they didn't have the same resources for record keeping and whatnot that the major leagues did. But we still have data because there were official games that were played. And last year, Major League Baseball and the Hall of Fame officially recognized the Negro League statistics as official Major League statistics. And they gave all of the Negro Leagues, there were 7 total, the same status that the American and National Leagues have and that the Federal League had before them. They were major leagues. So if you go onto Baseball Reference now, you will see statistics from Josh Gibson and Cool Papa Bell and Satchel Paige and all of those great Negro League players from their days in those leagues. So this got me thinking about, well, we have some top-line data in this report, in this book rather, that suggests kind of what the level of play was in the major leagues, but I really wanted to go more deeply into that. So the visualization that I created, which I think you're able to link to on the podcast page, it's on my Tableau public, so you can take a look at it, looks at team-by-team statistics during those 20 years between 1920 and 1948 and asks, what was the comparative level of play? So, of course, it's not a completely one-to-one relationship. There weren't a lot of head-to-head games. At least there weren't a lot of head-to-head games that were documented and where we have statistics for it. But what we can do is look at things like winning percentage, offensive statistics, pitching statistics, and we can ask, well, you know, what was the comparative level of play? How are the batting stats? How are the pitching stats? And what does that tell us about the similarities or differences between the two leagues? And so without wanting to steal, too much thunder from the conversation we hope to have here, I think what we're able to see is that there was a very, they were almost at the same level. There was basically an identical level of play between the major leagues, the white major leagues, and the Negro Leagues during this golden age period. And I just think that's such an important thing to be able to say, that these were not substandard leagues. These were major professional leagues in professional baseball with terrific players that were playing at a very high level.
Adam, no, this is Mark. The term organized baseball is something that's been thrown around for many years, and I guess I didn't realize until I read this book that it's a pejorative, really, because organized baseball was used by Major League Baseball as a pejorative to say, well, those aren't real baseball leagues. If you want real baseball leagues,
right?
You have this. I thought it was just organized baseball started like in the 1860s and 1870s. No, that's not what organized baseball refers to. It's prejudicial, and that is at the root of all of this. That they had to do this because Major League didn't want to acknowledge, and so head-to-head games, the few that were there, you can't look at them as indicative of the one league playing against the other league because not everybody played.
It would be like looking at the All-Star games and trying to determine which league was better because who won the most All-Star games in that period. It's not indicative of what the leagues were like when they were playing regular. Yes, obviously they want to win in an exhibition match, but it's not the same. And I think, first off, as I say, as people that go through this data all the time, like when we're doing episodes, we sit there and have pages of Baseball Reference open. So the people that like you that do the data visualization, thank you so much just on that, because when you're trying to compare a mass of players and having to like manually flip through every single piece of data, it's a lot easier just to look at a nice put together graph by somebody and just be like, oh yeah, that's where they are.
Well, that's what visualization does.
Yeah.
In the end, that's why we do it, because you could, and if you're motivated to, you will pour through all those pages on Baseball Reference. But especially when there's something in DataViz called a 7-second test. And the idea is you should be able to look at a graphic and within 7 seconds, you should know what it's about and what it's trying to tell you. And if it doesn't pass that test, you're going to move on to something else. You're going to scroll on to the next tweet, or you're going to, go on to the next channel or whatever it is. So that's exactly why we do it. So thanks to people like you who are interested in this sort of thing, because this is why we do it.
Yeah, and
really,
it allows us to get deeper into. I think when we talked about having conversations about Josh Gibson, how many home runs did Josh Gibson really hit?
Right.
And because of the documentation, and it isn't perfect, we understand that. That's not a reason to not include these people, because they didn't have the reporting levels or trust in the reporting. And we're sort of parsing this together from all kinds of stuff, and it's still being updated, right? I mean, we're hoping we'll have more players, more inclusion.
Well, that becomes part of the history. Is what I would argue, that and Josh Gibson's a really good example, because if you go to his baseball reference page, that will tell you that he hit about 165 home runs, I want to say. And so those 165 home runs happened during documented Negro League games with other Negro League teams that were written up somewhere where there's an official record. So when MLB and Stat had picked up those records, that's what went in, 165 home runs. Well, depending on what other accounts you read, because a lot of these games were barnstorming games, or they were exhibitions held with major league teams or against semi-pro teams. So if you look at all of those accounts, he may have hit, I think his Hall of Fame plaque says over 800 home runs.
Right.
It's a huge
You can read some articles where he hit over 900, which would put him ahead of Soharu, and he would be the undisputed global home run king. So, forget Barry Bonds, forget steroids. He would be well in front of anybody else. And so the way I take this is it's an historical lesson. And it has to do, of course, with systemic racism. It also has to do with how do we account for things, and what is an official account. And it just leads to a lot of really interesting conversations, and the idea that, if we interpret history as something that's documented, well, what does documentation mean?
Right.
So there's really a lot to unpack there.
And I think
some really interesting ways.
I think you raised such a good point about it being about systemic racism, because kind of like what my father was echoing with it being, the start of organized baseball. Even when you talk about these players, and myself as somebody that's trying to give them credit, the way in which I find myself talking about giving them credit is it's like you have to think about how you're framing the entire conversation, because we're not starting from a point where Josh Gibson is an equal player to the the white major league baseball players that were playing at the same time. Like, you don't start off from that headspace. And that's the issue, that we've been conditioned because of our entire time talking about baseball to treat the major leagues like it's some kind of separate entity that is better than the rest of the leagues. And therefore anything accomplished in the major leagues is more meaningful than
somehow
Josh Gibson.
Better.
Yeah. Josh Gibson hitting 800 home runs, or hitting 800 home runs in the Japanese league. Well, it's that doesn't really count because it wasn't in the major leagues, but why? It's still baseball. It's still part of it. Now, obviously there's caveats to that. We're not going to say the kid that hit 1,000 home runs in his backyard is a home run leader for Major League Baseball, but we're not talking about anything close to like that. Yeah, it was a barnstorming exhibition game, but that was still a game between professional baseball players. Why are we treating it like it's somehow a lesser form of baseball?
Yeah. Well, and another good example of that is when the Dodgers signed Jackie Robinson. And of course, this was before free agency, when the reserve clause still dominated. But and you hear this when soccer teams sign somebody and they pay a transfer fee, or when a current major league team signs a free agent. What's part of that deal? Well, there's some kind of compensation, and it might be draft picks, it might be money, that there are lots of ways to handle that. Well, when the Dodgers signed Jackie Robinson, and I think the Kansas City Monarchs held his rights at that time, the Dodgers didn't pay any compensation.
Right.
And so it speaks to exactly what you're talking about. this other team is not part of organized baseball. We don't owe them any kind of transfer fee or comp fee or anything like that.
Like looking back on it, they were probably like, they should be grateful that we're picking up one of their players.
Yeah.
And like it would speak to them like that. Like somehow like, oh, we're doing them a favor. Like, really? No, you're taking one of their best players.
You're taking our talent. Yeah. And that was why the major leagues declined, because or the Negro Leagues, excuse me. That was why the Negro Leagues declined, because the quote unquote major leagues were signing all of their talent.
And it was really interesting. Because my father pointed out something that I didn't know about the Negro Leagues until recently. So all throughout, 1920 to 1948 in Major League Baseball, the spitball was outlawed. That was not the case in the Negro Leagues at the time.
Right.
So when you think about that, you're talking about these guys coming over, these guys playing. They're like, oh, wait, I don't have to deal with this not legal pitch anymore? Okay, yeah, thanks. I'll take that all day.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure Satch loved that.
Oh yeah, he's like, this is great.
And I hadn't heard that either, but that's really interesting, because something that came out in this analysis was, on the pitching side, I plotted strikeout to walk ratio and earned run average. And the earned run average in the white major leagues was a little bit lower, but the strikeout to walk ratio in the Negro Leagues was higher. And so that explains a little bit of that. That if,
if anything, it lends yourself to both of the points there, that not only were the pitchers probably just as good, but the hitters were actually probably better.
They're
still hitting with these guys throwing a pitch that's completely illegal.
Yes. And as evidenced by when these guys got to the major leagues, right? Invariably they were among the best players on their team, if not in the league. They had great success right from the start. Well, in that respect, maybe it was a little easier. I don't have to, except for Gaylord Perry, notwithstanding, you didn't have to.
Well, and Satchel pitched until he was 65 years old. I might be exaggerating slightly, but
that's the great part about Satchel Paige, is like, he pitched to 65. I'm only exaggerating maybe slightly.
Right.
Most guys, you're just like, oh yeah, that was 30 years ago. For him, it was like maybe 5 or 10.
But
he didn't eat fried food or run, so.
We talk about the racism and how rampant it was in every aspect of it, and that started with probably Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who was sort of the guy who stopped anything from progressing, and as he reigned over baseball for over 25 years. And I put a picture up because it was his birthday of a one-armed Major League Baseball player who played in 1945 for the St. Louis Browns during the war, so they had trouble getting players, and this kid Pete Gray had his arm cut off. Famous story if you follow baseball and all that kind of stuff. And so
there was a TV movie about him.
The movie about it.
I only remember that because it was in that Strange but True baseball stories you had to be reading all the time as a kid.
So somebody posts against it going, well, he got to the major leagues before black players. Shaking my head. And I'm like, right. So, this guy, a one-armed guy, got to the major leagues before able-bodied, Negro League players could play in the major leagues.
It was like the same way you had guys like they hired wasn't the midget also back then?
Same guy, Bill Veck. So,
that's right. Yeah, that was Bill Veck. Yeah,
Bill Veck actually was the St. Louis Browns, guy, and then he went over and he hired Eddie Gadel in 1951 to bat for there. But more interesting about Bill Veck was that he tried to buy the Phillies when he was about 28, right? Really young. And he had a group together, and he was going to bring in all Negro League ball players, to be, and Landis stopped this, going, this is not going to happen, wouldn't allow him to buy the team. And when he finally got control of the team, which were the Indians in the late 40s, he was the guy that brought in Larry Doby, who joined the major leagues about a month and a half after Jackie Robinson joined the Dodgers in 1947. So,
and it's really interesting here looking at your visualization. The visualization for everyone will be linked in the description of this episode. So if you want to go in there, I highly recommend checking it out and looking on it because it's extremely interesting. And I think for me, the most interesting thing looking at this is that, one, I didn't realize there were 7 different Negro Leagues prior to that. I thought there was just always one named that.
One,
but when you
right.
look at the winning percentages, basically all of them are really solid outside one, which really just speaks to the amount of both talent and depth that you could have 7 different leagues that all actually had good talent spread across them.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point. The outlier that you're talking about only played for one season. So, and this is a winning percentage that's aggregated across the whole league for all teams. So you would expect that they would be pretty close to 500 because these are teams that are by and large only playing against each other. But still, yeah, that's a point really, really well taken, that, you know, you don't see a lot of outliers there. And it does kind of prove the point that they were all playing at a very similar level.
And it's because they played at the same time is why you can do this, right? So I'm sitting here thinking, right, could you compare the 1920s and overlay that against the 1970s or the 2010s and just say, how are the players today? Well, because they didn't play at the same time, it doesn't have quite the gravitas that these were contemporaries, even though they didn't get to play with one another or against one another.
Right, yeah. That's a really good point, yeah.
I think one of the things going forward and just how we think about this and the way Major League Baseball approaches it is that at the end of the day, I'm glad that they're fixing the mistake that they've made for all of these years, because the only reason that all of these Negro League players aren't Major League Baseball players and considered the exact same was because of a decision Major League Baseball, the organization itself, made back in those days. So it wasn't because like, oh, they were across the ocean or something. No, we just decided these people don't count for 60 years because of systemic racism. So the idea, now that we're going back, we need to look at this and not talk about them like they should just be talked about as if they were another part of Major League Baseball, not as if they're this separate entity. And I think that's where people really need to get to, where we think of them as Major League Baseball. This was just baseball. It wasn't its own separate thing. It wasn't some kind of lesser thing. It was just baseball. And it was unfortunate that we didn't get to see what would have been the highest quality product at the time, which would have been the leagues integrating and everybody playing together.
Yeah. And what I hope is that having these data available helps us get there. That because we have the ability to say, you know, here's this league, here's that league, here's this bucket, here's that bucket. And to your point, that we're able to make comparisons about players who are playing at the same time. It makes it less of a theoretical exercise.
Yeah.
And I hope, yeah. Oh,
well,
sorry. No, and
go ahead, Adam.
I hope that more people do this, basically, so we're able to have more conversations like this.
Right. We're still going to argue, you know, is Babe Ruth the greatest, you know, baseball player? But why not we argue that is Josh Gibson the greatest baseball player? Because what you've helped do here is establish that the platform he stood on was the very same that Major League. So no longer you can say, well, he didn't play in the Major Leagues. It doesn't count. That's no longer an argument you can make. Right, by this.
Exactly.
And so Josh Gibson should be thought of, wow, maybe it's Josh Gibson and Barry Bonds, and Babe Ruth isn't in the conversation at all.
And it's coming, because I can remember when I was a kid. I mean, we heard about Josh Gibson, and I would hear about them when you would talk baseball with people, but they were always kind of talked about, and I hate to say it like this, but it's kind of how I remember it, like kind of like they were tall tales, like somebody was telling you about like Paul Bunyan or something, like, oh yeah, and there was this mighty guy who played in the Negro Leagues who could hit the ball over a mountain. It was like always kind of told to you like, it didn't really happen though, but the data's there, it happened, and we just chose to ignore it.
Right. And the cool Papa Bell expression, right, that he could turn the light off, he was so fast, and get into bed before it was dark, in a sense worked against how good these players were, because it was sort of a joke, and you know, those are the things that are left behind, and that doesn't define cool Papa Bell as a player or a human being. But that expression, that little incident is something that sort of follows his legacy around and has nothing to do with him as a baseball player, other than the guy was pretty fast.
And I mean, I'll call myself out. It's telling that I know that about cool Papa Bell, but I couldn't tell you any of his career statistics. That's the problem, is that I can think of a tall tale relating to this guy first instead of, well, yeah, sure, he had. It's like if you only knew Yogi Berra expressions and you didn't know anything about Yogi Berra the player. Like you're missing out on why him saying this and these things said about him were relevant.
Yeah, but the ability to compare statistics now that we have them. So I'd love to put cool Papa Bell on a pedestal with Ricky Henderson, so that, you know, they're not just two really brash and frankly beautifully brash base stealers, but okay, let's see how they really compared to each other. over the space of a career.
Oh, I like that.
So, yeah.
I think we can do that. So you kind of, got into this. Do you have other data visualization projects that you think about that are you're exploring, that you're considering exploring along the lines of Ricky Henderson versus Cool Papa Bell?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's one of them. Something that I'm also looking at is how can we render these data? So looking at the visualization that you see and asking, well, are these the right colors? Is this the right way to look at it? That's something I think about a lot. Let's see, what I've also done a visualization, which I think is also on my Tableau public, to look at the 2020 season. Because as we know, that was a truncated season because of COVID. There were only 60 games. And there was this really bizarre spring training where they were at spring training for about 2 or 3 weeks. And then that got cut short. Everyone went home. Then the season started again at the beginning of July, and there was maybe a week or two of spring training. So there was an open question around what's the quality of play going to be this year? And, are pitchers going to take half the season to get acclimated to pitching again? Whereas usually they have the month of April to do that. And so now if they take a month to, get used to things, well, the pennant races will all be over. So what are we going to do? And so the visualization that I came up with was comparing that 2020 season to, I think the 2 years, the previous 4 years rather. So you had 5 years of data. And both for pitching and for batting, like with the one that we've been talking about today. And what I found is that 2020 really wasn't an outlier, that when you actually extrapolate that 60-game season, sure, the absolute statistics were very different. Far fewer home runs, far fewer strikeouts, far fewer hits. But when you look at averages, the numbers were almost the same. And when you regress them and you find out, what are the regression lines and what are the statistically significant differences between each year, there really aren't any.
It was one of the reasons. Yeah, it was like, coming out of 2020, I was being like, I'm not going to take any player's performance both in 2020 and in 2021 and try and use those 2 years to make a referendum on who this guy is, as we did that to Dom Smith.
Well, actually, you're lying, Gordon, because we chose Conforto and McNeil for our fantasy team, and they killed us last year because they both did nothing on the basis of they had a really good 2020, thinking they're ascendant, they're going to be great.
I'm going to believe in them in 2022 because I'm not going to hold 2021 against them.
Yeah. And based on that, Juan Soto lit up the league in 2020, and he also lit up the league last year, should have won MVP if you ask me. And so hopefully he'll do that this year.
Although I wouldn't expect a Nats fan to really have a lot of love for Bryce Harper, so I would just say that.
No, I don't.
I will say this.
No.
It frustrates me watching Juan Soto because as a Mets fan, he's so good. Like, it's very rare to watch a guy, even at that age, just for me to gush about Soto for a minute, watch a guy who's 21, 22, who has probably the best approach at the plate that I've seen from a hitter. Like, his at-bats are just so good, and his ability to work counts. It's just like, he plays like he's a 15-year veteran in his like third or fourth season.
Yeah.
It's so impressive.
And he could be my son. That's how young he is. So
well, and unfortunately, as Met fans, we're going to see him for the next 15 years, and we just got rid of Freddie Freeman out of our division.
All we can hope is that the Nats decide to Freddie Freeman him at some point.
Well, I know you're both Mets fans, but I sincerely hope that you continue seeing him in a Nats uniform and that we sign him for what's probably going to be the GDP of, I think I actually looked this up, the Turks and Caicos Islands. So, yeah.
And we'll
one of the smaller Caribbean islands, yeah.
We'll just all enjoy the really weird deja vu moment when Max Scherzer is pitching to Juan Soto this year.
Yeah, that's going to be really,
that's going to be bizarre.
Have fun with that because he is a gem. He's terrific. So yeah,
I think I speak for everybody when I am so glad that there's baseball this season because we get to watch Jacob deGrom and Scherzer pitch on back-to-back days, and I can't ask for anything more than that.
That's great.
Well,
that's great.
Adam,
thank you.
I think Gordon and I would be very happy if you came back and did another one with us, and perhaps on some of the other aspects that we discussed, whether it's Henderson and Cool Papa Bell, or just sort of being able to compare them in a way that people don't think of normally. And we will link to your piece of content there so everybody can kind of see what we saw right away.
Yeah. So yeah,
I'm going to get on that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so everybody, in the description for this episode, you'll be able to find links to both Adam's Tableau and the specific one that we were discussing here today. I definitely recommend checking them out. If you like our podcast, you will like this info. It's really interesting.
Thank you so much. And definitely look for me to come back. So I'm going to get right on that comparison we talked about with Papa Bell versus Ricky Henderson, and we'll talk about that. I'm looking forward to it.
Great.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Breaking content here on Almost Cooperstone. So next episode after this, and we'll only go 1 week after this week's episode, we're going to go with our 2022 season preview and picks. You don't want to listen to us because we'll probably get a lot wrong. But we'll do
last year was not good for us.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. This was fun.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform.
And you can follow us on Twitter at Almost Coop.